Remind you please also that let's give everyone a fair go. We might agree there will be a chance to ask questions and make a point at the end, but this is a chance when we listen. Thank you.
Thank you. Cannabis was first prohibited in New Zealand 80 years ago by the Dangerous Drugs Act 1927, and it was a solution for a non-existent problem. There was virtually no cannabis use in New Zealand. But I want to depart from cannabis and alcohol, though maintaining faith with the question, is prohibition rational? I want to look at a much more contemporary instance of the application of prohibition, which I would call completely irrational, and that is the recent reclassification of BZP as a Class C1 controlled drug alongside cannabis. As you know, and very appropriately, the legislation, amending the Misuse of Drugs Act 1975, prohibiting BZP, party pills, came to force on April Fool's Day. But you will also be aware that less than 3 years ago, and this is my main point, that Mr Anderton sponsored an amendment to the Misuse of Drugs Act creating a brand new regulatory regime for restricted substances, a new schedule, commonly called Class D, for substances which wouldn't be prohibited for personal possession or use, but which would be regulated. That was just 3 years ago, and under that legislation, elaborate provision was made for the creation of a regime which would monitor quality, points of sale, advertising, signage, storage, and all the rest of it. Not one thing was done. The Ministry of Health sat on its hands and did nothing. That amendment was introduced largely on the recommendation of the Expert Advisory Commission on Drugs, which has a statutory remit to advise, in this case Mr Anderton, on the appropriate classification of drugs. In 2004, it concluded there was not enough evidence to classify BZP as a Class C1 controlled drug. Less than 3 years, in fact less than 2.5 years later, it changed its tune. Now BZP was harmful enough to be prohibited altogether alongside cannabis. What occurred in the interim? Well, the truth of the matter is that Mr Anderton, and let me quote his very words from Hansard, I commissioned new research, 2008 Hansard earlier this year. He commissioned new research to the tune of 300 or 400,000, wearing his hat as chair of the Ministerial Committee on Drug Policy, and that research involved several people on the Expert Advisory Committee of Drugs, and in particular one study which was crucial to the reclassification, the banning of BZP, was the Medical Research Institute New Zealand study. One member of the committee which decided to ban BZP was employed by the Medical Research Institute and was involved in the study. Several other members of the committee which banned BZP or recommended its prohibition were also compromised by conflicts of interest because they were either referees for research proposals, the BZP research proposals, or external advisors to other research proposals. In the result, the Expert Advisory Committee recommended, on the basis of this research, which wasn't peer-reviewed in the first instance, which was interim, preliminary, draft or summary, not in final form, that BZP be prohibited. Following a public clamour during the public consultation process, independent peer reviewing was conducted, and those peer reviews were extremely critical of the quality of the research. Furthermore, the decision to recommend that BZP be banned was not a unanimous decision of the committee. 3 members of the committee disagreed. One thought that BZP, against the majority position, that these pills were of moderate harm, thought they were of low harm. 2 thought that they were of moderate to low harm, and 2 more weren't at the final meeting which recommended that they be banned. I call that a tie. My point is this. In 2005, the legislature at large created a new regime for the first time, a regulatory model, which has long been advocated for cannabis. But nothing was done. Indeed, in early last year, the Social Tonics Association of New Zealand, which represents the major importers, distributors, marketers and retailers of BZP and so-called legal highs, commissioned Chen Palmer lawyers to draft a set of regulations covering exactly all the detail which the Ministry of Health had not bothered to do anything about under this amendment. And they handed it to Mr. Anderton on a plate in February last year. Professionally drafted regulations, but what did he do? Not a murmur. Hell-bent on prohibition. This, to my mind, is a scandal. And I leave you with this thought. Last year, the Expert Advisory Committee on Drugs recommended that Salvia divinorum, so-called Mexican tripping weed or diviner's sage, be made a restricted substance. But I think that it will serve its time in the holding pen of restricted substances under the 2005 amendment, only again to be prohibited. And this will go on as new substances replace other prohibited substances. Where will this end? This is an exercise in futility, in my view. Now, I would be very pleased to answer more questions about the detail of the decision-making process of the Advisory Committee on Drugs a little later, if anybody would be good enough to address them to me.
I have a strange suspicion that might happen.
But we really are entitled to ask the Associate Minister why nothing was done in that time.
They legislated so that they couldn't put them down.
Quite possibly. My own view is that regulation is simply a stalking horse for the inevitable prohibition. The alternative possibility is that regulation is expensive. It requires time and resources. Much better, prohibition, much cheaper on the surface. But of course, as we know, the prohibition of cannabis costs, on a conservative estimate, through police, other institutional criminal justice time, somewhere between $150 and $200 million annually. We have lost a wonderful opportunity to chart a new direction in drug regulation in this country, all through the indolence of the Ministry of Health. Or perhaps there are some deeper explanations.